If you've been here with me at 5 o'clock this morning, this is what you would have seen. It's peaceful here now, but it won't be quiet for long. When dawn heralds the start of another day, it'll be a very different place. For this is Southampton, one of Britain's busiest ports. In the course of a summer day, over 100 ships of many different sizes and shapes will arrive and depart to move passengers and freight around the world. It hasn't always been as busy as this. Southampton used to be a small seaside town. It had one of the first railway stations, which put it firmly on the map. It also had a small port, which had looked much the same for years, until a Canadian shipowner changed all that. When this man built his first steam-powered ship, he started a revolution which changed the world forever. His ideas proved popular, and his company was soon providing people with a new way to travel long distances in comfort and at speeds which had never before been possible. As ships got bigger, the accommodation on board became more and more luxurious. For the crews that sailed those ships, it was a rather different story. Shoveling coal into rows of boilers in sweaty engine rooms can't have been much fun, especially when seas were rough. But on passenger decks, it was a good time to be around. The world had begun to seem a much smaller place, but two disastrous wars were to change all that. Luxury liners were converted to become troop ships and hospitals. As battles raged around the world, peaceful seaside resorts became battlefields, and thousands of people died. In 1914, my father volunteered to give up his job and join the army. He boarded an overcrowded troop ship in Southampton and went off to join his regiment in France. After a very rough crossing, in which everyone was sick, he arrived at a port which was being used to supply troops and supplies to reach nearby towns, where the first enemy troops had been heard approaching. From here, he and his regiment marched for days to a series of towns and eventually ended up in frontline trenches, where they would remain under almost continuous fire for 4 years. When the war ended in 1918, my father came home. When he came home, he wrote a detailed account of the 4 years he'd spent in the trenches. When he'd finished his notes, he put them away in an old cabin trunk. As he'd never talk about the war, and never told anyone where they were, they stayed where he put them for 95 years. I spent 2 years transcribing his words, and then sold my house to try and raise enough money to get his story published. a limited number of copies were printed as a first edition. One of those copies was spotted by a national newspaper, which quickly saw that it was unique and gave it extensive coverage. That interest was quickly reflected overseas, and the book has been reprinted many times and has recently been filmed for television. In that television programme, I retraced my father's steps and went back to places he'd served in to see what they're like today. To do that, I had to find a suitable ship. Armed with a copy of his book, I eventually boarded a cruise ship, which was small enough to get to France and then along the River Seine, as his troopship had done. When he was there, they looked like this. Today, many things have changed, but ships can still land passengers right in the middle of town. The cathedral, where he heard the sound of guns approaching echoing round these walls, has survived 2 wars, and it's still there. And there were other places too he would have recognised. I decided to go back again in lighter and warmer days. This summer I took another ship owned by the same company and went back again. Life on board was much more lively, and getting back to the places I wanted to visit was a thoroughly enjoyable experience. Again, I was taken right to the centre of the places I wanted to see. Here I was able to walk from the ship through streets which were full of life to visit the magnificent cathedral. After surviving 2 wars, it has been restored, and it contains some magnificent paintings by an artist who was born and lived in this area for most of his life. From this very lively city, I moved to Amsterdam, where the advantages of travelling on a fairly small ship were again readily apparent. There's a modern cruise terminal here. It's well managed and in a very convenient place, right at the heart of things. After a short walk into town, I went back to my ship and spent a pleasant hour seeing how Amsterdam's residents enjoy their weekends. It was a good way to end a very pleasant trip. I spent most of the last 50 years making films and television programs around the world. I and my crews have visited many countries, some of which are very different today. We tried to capture them for posterity, and in this film you'll be able to join us on our travels. We've filmed and travelled in many different ways, some more comfortable than others. Ships of all sizes have taken us round the world. For a Dutch company, we recorded the birth of river cruising, At that time, it was an entirely new concept. They had built a boat designed to sail from Amsterdam along the Rhine Canal and on to Switzerland. In those days, many bridges were lower than they are today, and at certain points the captain and his crew had to make some very quick adjustments. Today, river cruising is big business, and we've made a number of films on that too. We've sailed to New York on the magnificent QE2, which is still my all-time favourite ship. We flew back with Air France on one of their 5 Concorde aircraft. It got us from New York to Paris in 5 hours. A few months after we made that trip, an Air France Concorde caught fire and crashed shortly after takeoff, killing everyone on board. I don't know if it was the plane we had travelled on. We've spent many hours travelling by air to meet the individual requirements of different sponsors. For Freddie Heineken, we filmed the building and maiden flight of the world's largest hot air balloon. It was his idea to build what no one had ever done before. It was 10 times larger than a London bus and designed to carry far more people than any hot air balloon had done before. When trial inflations had been completed, everyone was reasonably confident it would take off, but no one was quite sure how or where it would land. Fortunately, everything did go according to plan. In another film, for the government of what was then called Ceylon and is now Sri Lanka, we made several films to show their delightful island to the world.
From the air it looks so peaceful, but down below it's a different story. For hours, thousands of people have been arriving. Over 80 elephants, bringing their meals with them, have come along too. There's no room at all on any of the pavements. For tonight, there's a show no one wants to miss. Behind the scenes, the stars are getting all the attention, watched by visitors who are unlikely ever to forget the scene. For this is Candy, and tonight is the night of the August moon, the night of the Perahera.
Since that film was made, Sri Lanka has survived a civil war and a dreadful tsunami, which cost many innocent lives. Today, I'm glad to be able to report that the welcome its people gives visitors is as warm as it was when we were there, and many of the places we saw are much as they were. It's still a great place to visit. Italy was one of the first overseas countries we filmed in. In the 1960s, it was much quieter than it is today. Like many of the other locations we visited, it's become far more popular as the years have passed. The results of climate changes around the world are particularly obvious here, and visitors planning to come this way need to take up-to-date advice before they make their trips. A few miles away, Naples and Italy's Amalfi Coast were also once relatively quiet. We first arrived there on a small cruise ship owned by Cunard, which was then a British company. It was just the right size, and we were ferried ashore and back in the ship's lifeboats, which limited the number of people who could travel at one time and stopped the area being overwhelmed, as it can be today. Pompeii, which was a few miles away, is still a great place to visit, but then it had had far less publicity, and the crowds it did attract were easier to control. Knowledgeable guides were on hand to explain what had happened when Vesuvius had erupted many years before, and how the ruins had been discovered and meticulously restored. We had great freedom to roam around. We also had the time needed to see and record what had been done. Today, political correctness and modern safety laws have resulted in many of the things we saw being hidden. Some have been fenced off. Others bought by museums, which have promised to protect them. So it's not quite the same as it was when we were there. But it's still well worth a visit. Again, a little research can make it easier to choose the best time to arrive. From Pompeii, we went to see the volcano which has erupted all those years ago. It's still classed as active, and as we climbed and lugged our equipment up to the summit, we prayed it wouldn't erupt again while we were there. At the top, we found the crowds included a guide who'd witnessed the last eruption, which was just after the end of the Second World War. He believed it could happen again at any time. Since then, it has continued to smoulder, and no one knows if he was right. Many things have changed since the first passenger ships set out to sea, and today anyone planning to set off on a journey faces a bewildering number of decisions which it pays to consider very carefully before setting off. Thousands who have already made up their minds will be leaving Southampton today. Perhaps some of them are on those ships over there. I'm on one of the last surviving steam-powered ships which is still based here. Shield Hall is Britain's last surviving working steamship. She was launched in 1955. As you can see, she isn't very large by today's standards. She spent most of her life working for Glasgow Corporation on the Clyde. Today, as a proud member of Britain's National Historic Ships Fleet, she's run as a charity by volunteers and a very experienced crew. Visitors are welcomed, and encouraged to wander around the ship, but there are always plenty of interesting things to see. While other ships are sailing off around the world, we're just going to sail along the coast and get a grandstand view of a major event which is taking place today. It's the Bournemouth Air Show. As it was aircraft which encouraged passengers who had always travelled by sea to take to the air, we'll be able to enjoy watching the display by some of today's most versatile aircraft, from one of the oldest working steamships still afloat. A few weeks ago, I was filming on another very special ship, which is slightly older than the one I'm on today. When I shot my film, she was still sailing, with a full crew and many happy passengers. Shortly after we finished filming, she had a major breakdown. The engines we saw in action fell silent, and there were fears they might never move again. Inspections showed the ship's main boiler was worn out and would have to be replaced. A public appeal was launched to raise the amount it was thought that would cost. Since then, much of that cost has been raised, and it seems that Waverley will soon be able to again take her rightful place in the history of great British ships, yesterday, today and tomorrow.